Tyranny of Hours. Aphorisms on History and Eternity. By David Bentley Hart, Patrick Robert Hart. It is not our intention in what follows to wax oracular. We mean only to provide a record of a flow of diffuse thoughts that arose in the course of a wandering conversation between the two of us, which never reached a final synthesis, and which did not yield a final picture, but which did at least produce a picture frame. If the form we have adopted, however, still strikes some of you as needlessly portentous and pretentious, it might soften your verdict to know the occasion of these reflections. On the day following a recent notable political development that, while not unanticipated, was still incredible, one of us, PRH, went to fetch out the 2 volumes of Guide to Board that the other of us, DBH, had on the shelves of his home office. There seemed no better way to react to the total triumph of political and moral nihilism in this country, the effective end of its Republican ideals, and the larger global drift backward toward the ages of robber barons, great powers, and the politics of blood and soil than to indulge in a merry season of Marxist situationism. The Society of the Spectacle and its later commentary may seem a bit dated in form and content, but only because of certain intellectual fashions and stylistic mannerisms that the intervening years have rendered quaint. In most important respects, the books have proved strikingly prescient. We could claim that the plangent Sibylline intonations of Debord's text woke a kindred Vedic fire in our breasts, but that would be only an excuse for our dialectical indolence. Suffice it to say that, to this point, we are only at the beginning of a stream of reflection leading toward a destination we can only hazily discern. To understand all is to forgive all. Section 0, let us start from the perspective of the masters of suspicion, as Paul Ricoeur would have it, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, and their kith. Though we need not end there. Section 1, humanity's historical consciousness, which, to employ a useful cliché, is at once a blessing and a curse, is an exile from the dreaming. As such, it is the source of a ceaseless restlessness and anxiety, and a longing for repose and for a return to the dreaming, whether in the oblivion of nature or in the oblivion of eternity. Section 2, if one is tempted to adopt a Freudian patois, one could call this the organic tension between 2 irrepressible drives, eros and thanatos, love and death, the desire to persist and advance, and the longing to lapse back into the perpetual rest of non-being. Or, in Bergsonian terms, one could call it the tension between an essential elan vital, organism's constant intentionality toward the future, and a restive tendency toward material dormancy. Whatever language one uses, however, to be aware of history, as opposed to the mere present of nature's exigencies and possibilities, is to be aware of death as a defining horizon, at once terrifying and strangely tantalizing. Section 3, to speak of the dreaming, admittedly, is probably to rely upon a fruitful misprision. The notion is putatively drawn from Australian Aboriginal culture, though the very word it is meant to render, Alcharinga, is in all likelihood an accidental invention on the part of anthropologists of an earlier generation, a phrase partially misheard and partially misinterpreted. Even so, the term has been adopted by many contemporary Aboriginal peoples as a felicitous expression of their tradition's spiritual imagination and genius. It also perfectly captures a certain ineffable apprehension, at once a memory and something impossible to remember, common to all peoples. Something in us, whether the elementary cells composing our bodies or the spirit most deeply hidden in the labyrinths of our unconscious selves, seems to recall a lost paradise of immediacy, either in the unity of organic nature or in the purity of a supernatural eternity. In history we are wanderers, seeking a homeland we feel we have both lost and not yet glimpsed. Section 4, or, to put the matter more simply and even more psychologistically, the birth of historical consciousness was a trauma from which humanity is perpetually seeking to recover, and philosophy and ideology are merely varieties of the talking cure. Section 5, it is religion, however, that is the supreme attempt at therapy for this nameless and constant distress. Humanity has been in flight from history ever since discovering that history was of its essence. What had been lost was the restfulness of an animal consciousness aware only of recurrence. Day and night, the seasons, feeding and sleeping, predation and flight. Human religious practice, probably inevitably, took the form of sacrifice and ritual repetition. It was perhaps an attempt to make even death once again not the ominous and mysterious horizon of linear time, but the occasion of return to that interminable repose in nature's constancies. And maybe a still more original loss of a spiritual homeland even more deeply concealed within human memory was the still greater source of this torment. Liturgical time, the regular cyclic reenactment of an eternal origin and destiny in rituals and festivals and fasts, is the periodic attempt at return to that immediacy through the cyclic representations of the gods and spirits and ancestors, and of our reconciliations with them. All of these gestures may ultimately fail, but they do sustain the human resistance to the exile of linear time and historical happenstance. Section 6, this, at any rate, conforms well to Mircea Eliade's notion of archaic religion as embodying the dramaturgy of the eternal return. The constant aspiration of escape from linear time into the time of myth, the realm of the gods and primal powers eternally present in illo tempore, beyond the flow of history's incessant loss of the past and irreversible momentum toward death. A flight into the enduring now of the dreaming, which has a cyclic structure located before, and yet also after and concurrent with the fleeting now of historical time. It is worth noting, incidentally, that Eliade's view of the matter was inspired principally not by Stoic metaphysics or Nietzsche's notion of eternal recurrence, but by Australian Aboriginal myth. Section 7, of course, historical consciousness did not arise in an instant or assume an unvarying form. A humanity haunted by mortality has never discovered a single manner of negotiating the discordance between its awareness of death and its longing for a timelessness in which death is overcome, through either constant ritual recurrence or mystical ascent to an aeon beyond genesis and decay. Even the flow of history was at first only dimly apprehended. As Guy Debord observed, time at first, understood as a linear movement, was still somehow conceived as static, as ever-present, as always returning rather than flowing away. Even among the earliest urban peoples, the structure of time was considered to be uniform. Among nomadic peoples, there was likely no notion whatsoever of any development, or even of a repeating sequence of historical phases. Section 8, Debord's Marxist analysis, was probably right as far as this is concerned. Only with a settled agrarianism could class hierarchy truly evolve into a stable system of labor and rule, and into an estrangement between one class confined to the time of ceaseless production, and another class able to remain aloof from that time in a mythic milieu in which the surplus value of labor could be consumed in the form of leisure. The arbitrariness of this division of the spoils, one might add, was typically concealed by the mediating ceremonies of festival, of sacred dramaturgy seeming to dissolve what was in reality an impermeable partition between production and consumption, by temporarily inviting all who labor into the spectacle of mythic time, to a participation in the dance of eternity, and to a share in the prudent distribution of food from the tables of the gods. Then the work must resume. Section 9, there was another sense, however, in which early human civilization came to accord historical time a kind of consequence of its own, as distinct from an eternal realm of meaning. At the very least, even though pre-modern human beings may not have had much of a concept of uninterrupted or linear historical development, they learned early on to think in terms of nations, empires, dynasties, and of great men who could harness the forces of events to the chariot of time and direct it towards some goal. This, though, is history as a record not of the acts of people, but of peoples, from whom certain individuals rise up as the embodiments of those grand narratives. And this means history understood simply as a record of the deeds of kings and of their realms, and as often as not, of a cycle of wars. Section 10, all of this at first yielded a picture of history, somewhere in between that of an unbroken movement toward the novelty of the future, terminating in the mystery of death, and that of the perpetuity of the eternal return. This was not, however, a concept of gyres, or of a spiral in which recurrence and progress were reconciled. Nothing so esoteric. It was only a notion of stability within vacillation, changelessness within change. For most of pre-modern human culture, history was conceived of as the repeated degradation of cosmic time in a sequence of epochs, culminating in a period of terminal decline before the cycle repeated. The age of gold, followed by one of silver, then one of bronze, then one of iron or wood, or the Satya Yuga, the Treta Yuga, the Dvapara Yuga, and the Kali Yuga. And needless to say, the present is always the final and most degenerate of these. Section 11 yet, in those times when and places where this mythic imagery was displaced by something more like concrete historical consciousness, the notion of a recurring process remained. The earliest worldly theorists of historical time tended to see it as a fixed rotation or shifting alternation of a strictly limited number of distinct phases of political, social, and religious possibility. For Plato in the Republic, famously, there is a constantly reiterated cycle of 5 distinct stages, declining from aristocracy to timocracy to oligarchy to democracy and finally to tyranny, before total social disintegration is at last succeeded by a new political cycle. And the best way of arresting this pitilessly disastrous process, perhaps indefinitely, is the creation of an especially durable form of aristocracy under the rule of a philosopher king. For Aristotle, while the episodic structure of the narrative was less rigidly determined, still its phases could take only a finite number of forms, either in relative purity or in varying degrees of alloy with one another. Proper polity, aristocracy, monarchy, democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. Section 12, the most striking theory, however, was that of Polybius, whose account of anacyclosis posited three principal forms of constitution: democracy, monarchy, and aristocracy, perpetually caught in a repeating circle without recorded beginning or foreseeable end. What causes that will to turn is a tendency within each of these forms naturally to devolve toward a very particular kind of decadence. Democracy deteriorates into autocracy until some strong political figure establishes a monarchy. This then degenerates into a tyranny, which leads to a coalition of powerful subjects who depose their king and establish an aristocracy. This then decays into an oligarchy whose corruption brings about a democratic revolution, which ultimately becomes autocracy, again initiating the cycle anew. Section 13, as much as such theories remain under the shelter of an overarching narrative of recurrence, they remain fixed within an ambiguous tension between mythic and historical time. This is not, of course, to say that the picture they present is not, or at least was not, essentially true. Whatever the case, though, this picture was a notable achievement of philosophical imagination. Rather than a simple bare relation between the divine realm of Iliad Tempest and the static order of labor and rule, it provided a vision of historical existence as involving genuine change, a real degree of unrealized possibilities, even a dynamic structure susceptible of rational reflection. Radical novelty, needless to say, may have been as yet unthinkable, as of course was any notion of final revolutionary change in the order of society. But now historical time began to emerge in human thinking as a dimension of real possibility, rather than an unvarying structure of actuality, and history had become a subject of reflection unto itself. Section 14 now, needless to say, things are very different. We today are capable of entertaining the Hegelian intuition that history might be an inexorable process of rational disclosure, every epoch of which at once exhausts a certain phase of human spiritual potential and constitutes a real advance in speculative wisdom. There may yet be some kind of law of anacyclosis subtending that otherwise linear narrative, or recurring epicyclically within the greater flow of ideal history. There is presumably a limit to the configurations of human association, after all, or at least a kind of causal intransigence in the way one configuration gives rise to another, from which it would require an immense labor of will and imagination to escape. Still, for us history is history, a realm of meaning in and of itself, moving continuously away from a past now impotent to return toward a future impossible to foresee. Section 15. This is obviously very much a part of the Christian heritage of Western thought. At least, the Christian narrative collapses the distinction between eternal truth and historical events, thus refusing to grant the possibility of a full knowledge of the divine in abstraction from discrete historical moments of disclosure. And indeed, more than mere disclosure is at issue. According to the Christian story, eternal truth is quite literally accomplished in and as historical events. And this brings to a hitherto unprecedentedly radical expression an eschatological religious picture shared by Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity, that of history as inexorably oriented toward a final verdict upon history, and toward a final age in which the eternal would arrive as the denouement of history. One could speak of this as the Zoroastrian or Persian or Magian axis of Aryan religion, which became the paradigm of all the Abrahamic faiths from the Hellenistic period onward. But obviously the Christian story involves a concept of development and irreversible historical particularity that exceeds the story of successive prophetic epochs of revelation, which may reveal one and the same eternal truth in varying registers, but which do not supposedly alter the very structure of reality, or of the relation between eternity and time. Section 16, and yet, all this being granted, the Christian narrative as typically understood remains mythic in the technical and somewhat hieratic sense. It does not consecrate all of history as a single unified development toward a final grand synthesis. Quite the opposite, in fact. It instead elects one particular history among countless others as the one true story of the eternal and the temporal alike, consigning all other histories to a secondary or even nugatory significance. Thus it ironizes, relativizes, and in a sense negates all other historical narratives of meaning. As much as sacred time has condescended in the event of Christ to become secular time, still the union is one of sacramental exception. Between the sacred and the secular there remains a division, a space of exile and alienation, a longing still for a lost and never yet known paradise. Between Eden and the kingdom of heaven, the way is narrow and the gate strait. The path across the abyss of ordinary time is a single tenuous historical stream. Section 17 today, for many of us in the West and in the greater sphere of Western intellectual influence, it is precisely secular time that we have freighted with a weight of ultimate meaning. We speak of the judgment of history, or of being on the right side of history, or even in moments of Hegelian afflatus of the rationality or cunning of history. Whether it is quite correct to speak of an immanentized echelon, it is certainly the case that for going on a few centuries now, perhaps we can isolate the French Revolution as a kind of watershed moment, both concrete and speculative. We have become able to conceive of the future as an openness to possibilities never before experienced or even perhaps cogently imagined. Moreover, in many ways we have invested it with the moral authority and discrimination of God, while removing from it all of his more terrifying and attractive qualities. And of course, it is almost trite to observe that in Marxism this conflation of terrestrial history with moral eschatology achieves one of its most poignant syntheses. Section 18, perhaps historical humanity, becomes conscious of itself fully only in revolution, because that opens up the future as genuine novelty. It also retrospectively converts the past into prologue, with a coherent meaning always pointing toward the true story. This means, however, that revolution also has a power to subordinate that history to the future in just another reprise of the myth of static eternity, by fastening upon an ever more remote rationale whose perfection allows even violence and injustice as provisional means to that ideal end. There is still no escape here from the tension between linear and cyclic time. Section 19, the prevailing myth, or its prevailing version in prosperous lands of the West, has been of late that this worldly eschatology is one of a sort of continuous, if asymptotic, approach toward perfect justice and even perpetual peace. Real events constantly conspire to disrupt this story, but in our most quixotic moments we cling to it nonetheless. Such is the nature of faith. In truth, history as we know it in the secular age is both a development toward abstract moral ideals as religious values and a ceaseless succession of forms of domination and violence. To seek an escape from history by way of history's verdict is yet another variation of the pathetic longing for the power of the eternal return to shatter our prison walls. Justice is not written into the structure of ordinary time, and sacred time remains forever over and beyond. It is no more meaningful to expect liberation from history by way of history than to expect a war to end all wars. History has no final verdict to deliver. As the supreme arbiter of human reality, it shows no partiality either to virtue or to vice, either to peace or to violence, either to freedom or to servitude, either to heaven or to hell. Section 20, we are manifestly in an era of profound historical darkness. The lamps are going out all over the world, to paraphrase Sir Edward Grey. The illusion of an ever-dawning age of ever greater justice, abundance, equity, and collective wisdom, and certainly of the end of history, is being rapidly and violently displaced by the cruel and jealous passions of nation and race, Reich und Evoke, and by the squalid ambitions of evil men whose power feeds on despair and ignorance. And no less bleakly, the pall of a climatological century of hell has overshadowed all our hopes for the coming times. Religion, predictably, has everywhere been conscripted into the struggle for historical domination and the resentful ideologies of identity. Section 21, who controls the past controls the future, but this may now be an obsolete maxim. All the old grand narratives have at last knelt down in submission before the sheer spectacle of late modernity. Section 22, if it is true, as Debord says, that capitalist time is time as commodification, which is constant production and infinite accumulation and disposal, without real festivity or pleasure, where there is no movement toward real life, and every person is only an exchangeable token in the constant flow of production and consumption, then ours is the age in which capitalist time has displaced history and eternity alike. It is an age of absolute change as absolute uniformity, or, to abuse the language of Deleuze and Guattari, the age of the univocity of production, the equivocity of products. This is at once the parody and the dissolution of linear history, but also of redemptive eternity. Instead of either eschatological or mythic escape from the tyranny of the hours, there is only a perpetual anxious loss of self in the flow of simulacra, which is to say, the horizon of death consuming all of time. The virtual age, which is capitalism achieving absolute purity as the dissolution of all reality into abstract commodity, is the reign of death in all things. Section 23. This tends to occasion not so much rebellion as resignation. The exhaustion of humanity with the current order of secular historical time has manifested itself in such symptoms as the Nihilo-nationalism of contemporary Russia, or the Chinese phenomenon of lying flat, and its analogues in other East Asian countries, or a decadent fatigue with democratic discourse in America, all to a very real degree in response to the overwhelming demands of modern productivity and consumption. There is a great spiritual malaise overspreading the late modern world. This is an ideal situation for those who possess the greatest power of consumption, insofar as it depresses any general will to resistance, or even the energy required to conceive of resistance, though in all likelihood they themselves cannot wholly escape its disenchantments. Section 24. Perhaps there is some way of deliverance from the endless tension between exile in linear time and the longing for return to immediacy. We have no great solution to propose, but only scattered intuitions to declare. Certainly, resistance to the powers, principalities, thrones, and dominions of the age may occur in history, but it is not of history. The perennial attempt of humanity to resolve the tension between mythic or natural time and linear or historical time produces always the same structure of recurrence, a tragic cycle that is only the wheel of Ixion on which humanity tortures itself. But it is still possible to entertain the hope that there is at least one path, as yet untried, that might lead beyond this desperate recurrence into a real future beyond all alienation and all struggles for power. For want of a better name, we might call it koinonia, to use New Testament Greek, or communism, to translate the term as literally as possible, or perhaps simply love. Section 25. Return to an eternity beyond this world, or to nature outside of historical consciousness, is a matter of the destiny of souls and bodies. The age to come, with its new sky and its new earth, is a matter of divine grace, which we have no power to summon. In either case, to allow ourselves to know this truly would be to take leave of all spectacular representations of the eternal or natural order of things in regimes of power and possession, and to learn to desire instead an economy and ecology of gifts, whose only governing order is the anarchy of love. This perhaps is also only a kind of Edenic nostalgia, but perhaps it opens up the possibility of a state beyond the anxiety of cyclic attempts at reconciliation with the oblivion of nature or of eternity, as well as beyond the eschatological verdict of historical rationality and linear time, simply a dwelling in the present always attempting to incarnate love, a sort of anti-historical consciousness, or of historical consciousness as the means of imagining a state beyond history, a eudaimonic eros oriented toward a politics and social order of charity. Section 26. Among the oldest known works of visual art depicting not just human forms but artifacts and emblems of culture, even some that persist into the present, are ancient rock paintings in Kimberley, Australia. There, alongside both animals and gods, both nature and the realm of the eternal, stand human figures adorned in raiment of a kind still in use in western Papua. Many of these images may be more than 19,000 years old, and the local Aboriginal peoples still maintain them against the ravages of the elements. Perhaps we might interpret them as a record of humanity awakening from the dreaming into the exile of history, just at the threshold between mythic and linear time, as well as one of the earliest attempts to overcome that estrangement through the mediations of art. They are, incidentally, works of superlative gracefulness. Section 27. As ever, human imagination is our one enduring refuge in the midst of the exile of history. Art is the surest medium of revolt against the tyranny of hours, because neither history nor history can be defeated in historical terms. The forms of physical and spiritual bondage that we ceaselessly create and reinforce in the realms of politics, wealth, and social hierarchy are always the same, because history is the blindfold that prevents the temporal from glimpsing the eternal in temporal terms. We could dilate romantically on bardic poetics as resistance to brutal facts in the manner of Yeats, but that would be to yield self-indulgently to temptation. What we will say is that it is in the arts that a sacred space for the imagination can always be opened up, And within that space it may be possible to break free from the ceaselessly purning gyre of our historical exile, not simply to seek oblivion in purely natural consciousness, or to seek to scale the heavens into timeless eternity, or to conjure the Eschaton by violent means, but rather to find our rest in a kind of time that reflects the peace of the eternal within a world of shadows, so that we are no longer haunted by the specters of immemorial tradition, or irresistible progress, or incessant production and consumption. We cannot say quite what that reality would be, or how properly to imagine it, but we must insist upon its possibility and its necessity.